At the end of the show yesterday, we started a conversation on Noah Rothman's new book titled Unjust, Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. It's a provocative look at important issues of justice, equality, fairness, race, and gender. To say it touched a nerve is an understatement. And while most shows would shy away from touching a third rail again, we're diving right back in.
Well, because Noah was disappointed because his mentions yesterday on Twitter were so positive.
No.
He wanted to see if he could get a few negative ones.
We're expanding our panel to bring in more voices. Noah is back with us. He's associate editor of Commentary Magazine and an MSNBC contributor. Author and NBC News political analyst Anand Giridharadas is back with us as well. Also with us, executive editor for National Review, Reihan Salam, executive director of Justice Action Network, Holly Harris, and Tiffany Cross is still with us. She is co-founder and managing editor of The Beat DC. Good to have you all on board. So should Noah start by kind of framing...
First of all, I think we have to say, once again, Eddie Glaude. He says he's stuck in traffic in Atlanta. This is the second day we've tried to get Eddie on this show. I'm starting to wonder.
You know, he influenced my thinking so much that I thanked him in this book, so I preemptively neutralized his criticisms because he's in the thing. He can't really be too harsh about it.
No,
we'll
I have a feeling he would be if we could ever get him on show.
As someone who lived in Atlanta for 7 years, I've got to defend Professor Glaude.
Oh,
that traffic is horrible.
No, he was back at his alma mater giving a speech, and he's stuck in traffic. For those that weren't watching yesterday, quick review. What's the book about?
Yeah, so social justice is a noble movement with a 200-year-old tradition that has been corrupted in the hands of its present activist class. They presently believe and preach that meritocracy is a myth. You are not free to rise as far as talent allows. That separatism is good explicitly to prevent social discomfort. That colorblindness is naive at best, dangerous at worst. You know who else believes that? White supremacists. The distinction between the two are blurred increasingly, and they are an obstacle to the necessary work of combating prejudice and institutional discrimination.
Well,
the cure for bigotry is not more bigotry.
So let's start with colorblindness. Yeah, I mean, you have to recognize, don't you? Don't we all? Shouldn't we recognize that white men are treated differently than black men? There is a reason why Gene Robinson has to tell his son, or had to tell his sons every night he went out, if you were stopped by the police, this is what you do, son. Every father with young black sons have to give the same speech.
The distinction that
my dad never had to give me that speech.
This is not an attack on racial awareness or self-actualization or the understanding that racial discrimination is real. It is the attack on a prescription, one advanced by John Rawls, the father of the theory of social justice, that institutions, in order to affect social change, positive social change, need to treat people unequally in order to achieve equality. There is no justice in that.
Do you think, and do you think white people are being treated unequally in 2019?
No, I don't believe that's true in an institutional perspective, and the ideal of America is to treat people equally, to aspire towards equality. It is the aspirations of a particular movement that be done away with, that we put a finger on the scales. And I think that's a philosophy that is corrupting. It is not evident in American institutions, but it is a philosophy that is gaining in prominence and power. And this, again, this is not an argument against real evidence of institutional racial discrimination. That's too broad a scope for any one book. This is evidence against a particular philosophy that prescribes discrimination in order to address inequality.
Anand, next question to you.
Look, I think the starting point for me for this conversation is not any one book in the present. It's, you got to go back. This country has a history. You can go back to 1492, you can go back to 1619 when the first enslaved Africans were brought here. You could go back to 1776 or 1787 when you have the kind of double story of this country. You have extraordinary ideals, some ideals that I think we would all agree were path-breaking and inspire us still. All men are created equal, the amazing amendments to our Constitution. And then you have a second part of that double story, which is the lived reality of American life. The fact that some of the people who wrote those words were slave owners, as we all know. The fact that for a very, very long time, and still today, it has been very hard for us as a country to live fully up to that, but we've done better and better. And I think where I come at this conversation a very different place is when I read American history, it seems to me that at every juncture, when we actually successfully extended those beautiful ideals in the double story to people who had been previously left out of it, whether it was to African Americans or to women or to people from other countries that were not Europe, with immigration change. In each of those moments, we did that because of we opened ourselves to the reality of people we hadn't really been listening to. We recognized truths that weren't the truths of dominance.
So is Noah missing that point in this book? Let's talk about Noah's thesis. What do you find offensive about Noah's thesis?
You can't handcuff someone and not handcuff someone else, and then take the handcuffs off and say, look, you're both free after 10 years of you living out in the free world and enjoying a life and you being in jail for 10 years. You're both free to be treated colorblindly and equally. There's a legacy in this country of women being shut out of institutions, of education, of progress, of legal protection, of African Americans, others. And to simply say colorblindness is an idea, is any colorblind policy going to close the racial wealth gap in America? I would love to hear anybody's plan to simply just treat everybody equally and narrow the racial wealth gap. Is gender blindness going to get maternity leave for women and other kinds of and anti-sexual harassment policies so women can feel as free and safe in spaces of power as I have felt my whole life? It is very easy to be a privileged person and say, hey, everybody should just be treated fairly. I'm just for everybody being treated the same. It's more interesting, to be honest. It just makes you a more interesting person to say, what do I not know about the experience of being someone? I'm curious, how many African Americans did Noah interview for this book? Not philosophers, just regular people living their and how did it challenge your reality, if at all?
Well, Noah, I would throughout that interesting reflection on the book that you have not read, I would suggest perhaps you get into it, because there are quite a few perspectives that you suggest I share that I do share in this book. This is an attack on a philosophy that, in the effort to aspire to the equalitarian ideals that you and I both share, has created a new set of victims in a very misguided but nobly inspired effort to achieve historical justice. And we got into some of them yesterday. Among them being the individuals whose names we will never know, who were made victimized by an effort to balance the scales against what is perceived to be historical discrimination and a historical perspective in American institutions that values the male perspective more than the female perspective and expands the definition of rape and sexual assault and adjudicated claims outside of a courtroom that re-victimized individuals who were victimized already when those verdicts were overturned in an actual court, and they found that their rights were abused and they were deprived of their Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights. I saw all day on Twitter that it was dismissed of that was just waved off as some sort of an idea.
What are you talking about here, Noah?
The efforts in the Obama era under Title IX to proscribe an expanded definition of what constitutes sexual assault and to adjudicate those claims on college campuses. That was the Dear Colleague letter in 2011, which resulted in countless examples of individuals, accusers and accused alike, who were deprived of the right to counsel, who were deprived of the rights of evidence, and when those claims were adjudicated in a real court, many of those verdicts were overturned, and many of the damages that were awarded to these individuals and from these colleges were re-victimizing these individuals. And the people who advocated for this sort of thing said, well, it's too much. It's too much to put these people through, to put them in front of their accuser to be confronted in a courtroom. But that is the notion of objective blind justice that this country was founded on. And the kind of justice that we're trying to replace it with doesn't look like justice to me at all.
Tiffany.
Yeah, no, I'm curious. I echo Anand's point about how many people you talk to, not just regular people, but I'm curious, did you engage actual think tanks? Did you talk to Spencer Overton at the Joint Center? Did you talk to Mark Morial at the Urban League? Did you engage any member of the Tri-Caucus for some of this research? And I have to say, I found it really telling that you champion people like Ronald Reagan and Dwight Eisenhower as folks who didn't, bang this racial drum like Donald Trump does. And I think for a lot of communities of color, look, they may have been more articulate and less clumsy than our current president, but absolutely, their words were just as damaging. Their policies were just as damaging. You talk about Ronald Reagan, not depending on people to, use race as an issue, but he absolutely did that. He racialized the debate on welfare. He painted the black woman as the face of a welfare queen, even though more white people were on welfare at that time, then in the 80s and still now. He campaigned on abolishing affirmative action. He wanted to roll back civil rights policies. He's responsible for some of the gun laws. As governor of California, he signed into law. He said, he's the NRA's boyfriend, but he said people of color, or not people of color, I'm sorry, he said citizens should not be carrying guns. He only did that after the Black Panthers took up arms legally to defend themselves. Dwight Eisenhower, you say, didn't do these things as well. Dwight Eisenhower is known for telling the Supreme Court, these poor white folks are good people. They just don't want their white daughter sitting next to oversized Negroes. Those are his words. So the fact that those two people are your champions to show that, these are good, righteous Republicans who never, perpetuated those racial tropes, it seems a bit of a disconnect to me when you say those things, and I imagine to a lot of people of color across the country.
It would be. I don't actually recall making those arguments.
Oh, and it was in the excerpt of the book that you said, I could read the exact quote where you said that Dwight Eisenhower
that naked
and Ronald
appeals
Reagan,
to racial solidarity examined by Donald Trump are rhetorically opposed by these individuals. Sure, I did not examine their policies in the book as you suggest I did. However, you mentioned affirmative action, and that's important because philosophically in this book, inaction to positively discriminate, to rise up, sort of had a collateral damage effect of negatively discriminating, and that was sort of an accident, a sotto voce, and we didn't actually dwell on that. Negative discrimination has now become the point.
What is negative discrimination?
That classes, whole tribes of individuals need to have a comeuppance, a due sort of reckoning with their historical privileges that they know or may not know that they benefit from, and likewise to examine those who have been victimized by historical forces that they may either be aware of or not aware of. That is negative discrimination.
Now, are you saying whites, men, people that have been in is that who you're talking about, who should have their comeuppance?
A philosophy that views not individuals as individuals, but as people who inhabit tribes, who inhabit a matrix of persecution in which they might not even be aware of it. But this is a very powerful philosophy, taught mostly on campuses, embraced by things like the women's movement, exemplified by things like intersectionality, which demonstrate for individuals who may not be aware that they have varying degrees of prejudice that they either suffer from or benefit from. And that is a sort of philosophy that I think is toxic, because it forces you to think about yourself and the people around you in ways that make you believe you're not master of your own destiny, that agency is not.
Many people aren't masters of their own destiny.
Well, I think it's a toxic philosophy. I don't think
I think it's an accurate philosophy, and I think with respect, I think your outlook on this is a bit myopic and based solely on your experience, and doesn't extend the intellectual debate with people who haven't had your history. I think when you look at what I got from the portions of the book that I read is you draw this false equivalency between Trump's base, and you call them social justice left. At times, it kind of felt like a euphemism for communities of color. I'm not sure if that's what you were defining. Maybe I
certainly not.
misinterpreted
Most social justice activists I've met are actually Caucasian.
Okay, fair. I was curious about that, but I think you draw this false equivalency, and I think certainly there are economically disadvantaged white people in this country. I think the reasons why they're economically disadvantaged are very different from the reasons why some communities of color are disadvantaged. And I think it's really dangerous to look at the current state of this country without looking at it through the context of historical systems that put those people in that position. You call that victimization, but I call that reality for a lot of people.
Some of it is, but very important questions have been raised by social justice activist groups, including Black Lives Matter, which have demonstrated clearly that there are historical injustices that are at play and that we are to be aware of. But a victimization idea, an idea that meritocracy is above you or out of your reach, and that forces are at work to keep you down, and that you have no agency over your own life, is preached by white nationalist groups as much as it is by the left.
Holly, want to get Holly in just a second. Reihan, I want to ask you, though, you can take your crack at the broad thesis here, but also Noah does say, as Tiffany points out in the book, that Trump sort of played on this to his voters, that there was a sense of victimization. He flipped it because you are white. You are a victim of this culture because you are white, and that we're losing the culture. It's slipping away from us. What do you make of that comparison of the two sides of the social justice movement?
I do think that thinking in these collective terms lends itself to ideas of victimhood that wind up being disempowering. More broadly, though, here's what I find really interesting and frustrating. When you're talking in group terms, you're not talking about other solidarities. You're not talking about other things that people might have in common, right? So if you are someone who is a person of color, but you happen to be very elite, you happen to actually be in elite spaces, elite circumstances, you have elite credentials, it makes perfect sense, right? That you would emphasize your color over your elite status. Not only that, but you might also try to efface the experiences of people of color who disagree with you. That's why I believe that what Noah is saying is so important. Emphasizing the individual, emphasizing the particular stories and circumstances that shape individuals' lives allows us to draw attention to the fact that, guess what? There are a lot of people of color who do in fact have influence, who do have power. And sometimes they will use social justice arguments, not always in the way that's purest of heart. Sometimes it's a way for them to win an argument, for them to gain power relative to other people who might belong to their own group, who happen to disagree with them, who happen to dissent from their opinion, or from members of other groups, and saying that, aha, you need to take a step back. Well, wait a second, this person might be white, that person also might be from Appalachia, or that person might be from a single mother family, or any number of things. That person might be unprivileged in all sorts of ways relative to you, someone who comes from a very elite background. So again, I'm not saying that's true of everyone, but it's something that one uses as a weapon.
I understand that, but so I was born, though, I was born in middle America, you know, sort of in the wonder years suburbs of Atlanta, Georgia, middle of the century. You know, my family was middle class. I talked about it before. My dad got laid off. We drove around the South looking for jobs for 2 years. They ended up doing pretty darn well. But even during that time, I mean, when I was in college, if I was going into an interview, if I walked into a room as a 6'4" white guy that looked like I looked, I'm serious, don't I have an advantage over somebody that walks in that's a 6'4" black guy that may have more money than me, whose dad may have run a company in New York, whatever, but don't I have a natural built-in advantage just because of built-in discrimination?
I've got to tell you, as a brown guy who's a foot shorter than you, I've got to tell you, I grew up with two parents.
You're far better.
I grew up, well, there's that.
There is that.
But, you know, look, I grew up in circumstances. Also, my parents came from a background. They had college educations.
Right.
They had all sorts of advantages, and they brought those advantages with them to the United States as immigrants. One thing that I find very striking when you look at a lot of these movements, right? I don't mean to generalize, but it is often the case. You see people who themselves brought elite resources from another society. And sure, you know, you had to scrap and scrape, that's true. But then they're interposing themselves into these arguments in ways that I find pretty frustrating. I'm not saying that you don't have a right to make an argument, but what I'm saying is that your experience in some ways was overcoming a lot more disadvantage than folks who might be, quote unquote, of color, but who actually did have very elite backgrounds and then leverage their status as a weapon.
Let me tell you something. I have had police officers pull me over in my lifetime in younger years, and I got out of my car when they were, I thought, like throwing their weight around a little too much, and I just stood there and I glared at them. And I glared at him for about 15 seconds longer than a black man would have glared at him. Because you know what would have happened if a black man my size had gotten out of the car? They would have been on the ground in half a second. Doesn't matter if they were their dad was a millionaire CEO. That's just the reality.
That's why you've got to be specific. There's something particular about the experience of African Americans, particularly of African American men, particularly in some corners of the country, that if I believe Noah cares deeply about it. I think that he is very attuned to it, and that is an offense against justice for all Americans and against the country.
So we agree on that. Okay, so
ideals.
Again, not to take over the whole conversation, because I don't like doing that on the show, of course. But, okay, let's talk about me walking into a room, 21, 22, 23 years old, University of Alabama graduate. I go in, I don't have a background that I mean, I don't know it. My parents didn't know anybody. I didn't have any contacts. I walk in, I try to get a job. And I'm sitting there, and Mika has seen this before. I'm sitting there with a boss that I can be, you know, we can be yelling at each other 1 second, the next second I'm going, can you believe who the Mets picked up? And we're all laughing and slapping each other's back. 23-year-old woman from Harvard comes in. 23-year-old white woman from Harvard comes in. She comes in, she has a great interview. She has better qualifications than me. and yet I get the job. Do you think that's...
Or you both get the job, but one gets paid more.
Do we think that still
Right.
happens?
Right.
Because let me tell you, that still happens. Even
It
for
still
guys like
happens.
me that had absolutely no background.
World's
My
changing
family,
Of course it
nobody.
still happens, and this book goes to great lengths to explain and to say again and again that institutional prejudice is real, that individual and anecdotal prejudice is real. It is demonstrable in statistics, and the approaches that the social justice left and the right that mirrors them have addressed in order to create coalitions to affect change, positive social change, are not working. They are alienating the people that they need. They are counterproductive to this necessary and important work.
Who are they alienating?
You know what? They actually. I will actually, since I've been playing devil's advocate, Mika and I quietly, at times throughout the 2016 campaign, would look at some of the things that Hillary Clinton's campaign would do and would shake her head and would be like, don't
One thing that's
don't
also
do that.
frustrating to me.
There are. Let me tell you. Here's the thing. Everybody always wants an honest discussion on race until there's a chance to have an honest discussion on race.
Let's have it. I'm curious.
No, I'm just saying that who is being alienated are the very people that were set up in, whether it's in Wisconsin or Michigan or Ohio and Pennsylvania, and being told, you white people are being taken advantage of, you're being left behind, they're not thinking about you, and you're going to pay.
Joe, can I make a point about that?
You're going to pay for it. And again, I say that as somebody that did not want Donald Trump to win, obviously. Yeah.
You know, I actually think I want to make a positive point about that, because I think actually one of the proofs that a certain kind of identity politics or that kind of lens works is that a lot, in my lifetime, white people, millions and millions of white people in this country, millions of men, have actually gotten a lot better at understanding experiences. Right. I actually was moved by this couple of stories you just told. And I don't know that you would have told those stories 20 years ago. I think we're all part of an awakening that is very much because of these new conversations that you can dismiss as identity politics or PC. But you know, the Gillette ad that caused so much of a stir, you know, this is actually working. People are getting better at understanding the desires for recognition of others. And in terms of your Wisconsin and other places point.
But hold on a second, and it works until there's a backlash.
Correct.
That elects people like Donald Trump and actually puts us in places that I never thought, as a son of the South, we would ever find ourselves as a country.
And that's why I want to say,
like Charlottesville. We already brought up Charlottesville once this morning. Things happening that I never imagined would happen in my lifetime are happening. And I'm not suggesting I have the answers to why they're happening, but
you're right. And I think this is where I want to say something to kind of my side, right? This is where I think there is a bit of a blind spot on my side, which is there's a kind of wokeness culture that is developing that, as you can hear, I in general think is a good thing for America and has awakened us to a lot of experiences that we didn't listen to. However, I think it is really important that kind of woke America, the new majority that is ascending slowly, is a movement of expanding the circle, not circling the wagons. And a question that when I travel this country and talk to groups, I often ask the following question. Is there space among the woke for the still waking? There are a lot of people in some of the states you described who are not going to Charlottesville, and they're not white supremacists. They also don't know all the terminology of the new kind of identity world, and they're on the fence. And they may go Trump's way. They may go the way of tribal nationalism. They may be seduced into new ways of thinking that feel a little bit uncomfortable. And I think it's really important for those on the left, those fighting for a more inclusive America, those in these social justice circles, to think of their cause as expansionary and generous.
Holly Harris of the Justice Action Network, you've been able to sit back and listen to this entire conversation. Let's bring you into it finally. What do you make of it?
Well, look, this is a very fascinating, complicated, very academic conversation, but I'd like to pivot and talk about the real-world application of identity politics and working toward a common goal. And really the best example of that was our work with our right-left coalition in passing that groundbreaking prison and sentencing reform bill at the close of the last congressional session. You know, we made a lot of mistakes in the beginning of the coalition in trying to homogenize all of these voices and speak with, you know, one message. And, you know, that really wasn't inspiring people, and our bill wasn't moving. And then, you know, then we went with some strategies where, oh, maybe we should just use conservative voices because Congress, the House and Senate are, you know, controlled by Republicans. And that wasn't moving the bill. And it was only when we cut these groups loose to speak, you know, with their own voice and to their own constituencies that we really started seeing the bill take off. And so we had groups that were messaging exclusively to racial disparities. Mika, you probably don't know this, but you helped to inspire many groups to talk about women and the indignities that women were suffering in our justice system. We had groups that talked about government overreach and failed government programs and excessive government spending. And then we had faith-based groups that talked about the power of redemption. And so, you know, we had all of the groups speaking to their constituencies, working their members, leveraging their positions on the bill to broaden the bill. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you know, we got the broadest possible bill with the broadest level of support from the far right to the far left. And I think moving forward, you know, that's the way that we'll be able to change laws and change lives in this country.
Oh.
That is a perfect pragmatic example of incremental change based on an effort to create a consensus around an issue that is real and serious and based in racial prejudice, hundreds of years old. It's the kind of thing that we should all be working towards. But to Anand's point, and I think that it's detrimental to that cause, this kind of silly wokeness culture that appeals to a social justice activist. My favorite example of that is the statue Fearless Girl. Fearless Girl appealed to social justice activism. It was an effort to say, look, we need more women in these positions of power and authority in financial sector. It was a commercial for a financial firm that was found by a Department of Labor audit to be systematically discriminating against women. It was an effort to hide from behind its own sins against the system, and it did spectacularly well. It still appeals to the same people that it was appealing to, and that kind of woke capitalism, in effort to gull social justice activists, is something that is very prominent and features prominently within this movement.
Tiffany?
Okay. Well, I think it's a very nuanced argument you're making. I actually respectfully disagree with a lot of your points. One thing that stuck out to me is your context that you draw, racial hoaxers, as you call them. And I think that's kind of dangerous to put out these days. Obviously, you can probably recount 3 or 4 incidents that were proven to be false, but then you think about the long list of things that actually happen or the crimes that go unreported. When you think about how maybe people of color view this in the context of, you know, you have all these people who were treated violently by law enforcement, like Joe said, and today the top Republican on the House Judiciary wants to have a hearing because they don't like the way Roger Stone was arrested, that he was, you know, treated poorly, but they say nothing about a 12-year-old child, Tamir Rice, being shot, or nothing of Laquan McDonald, or things like that. So I think sometimes that your argument comes across a bit reductionist and ignores some very important historical context. And we can talk more about it. I'd love to. This is a 3-hour conversation. I think we could have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope people read the book. But yes, truth is always the most important thing, whether that's uncomfortable or not. Truth is the value.
Noah Rothman, thank you for sparking a great discussion. It's trending on Twitter right now. Is that good or bad? I will never know.
Don't look at your mail.
No, do not
None
read.
of us.
Noah's new book is called Unjust, Social Justice and the Unmaking of America. And let's sell some other books. We thank the rest of the panel. Anand Giridharadas, his latest book, entitled Winners Take All.
By the way,
Reihan Salam.
That's a great one. But also, Anand's hair is responsible for half of the traffic on Twitter right now.
I've seen that.
Reihan's latest is entitled Melting Pot or Civil War. Tiffany Cross and Holly Harris, we need to have you back. Thank you very much, both of you as well. And somewhere in downtown Atlanta traffic, Eddie Glaude is yelling at his radio.
He's on the connector.
Coming up.
75-85. Yeah.
Coming up, first Russian trolls targeted the 2016 election. Now they appear to have turned their sights on the man tasked with investigating them, Robert Mueller. And from a wall to steel slats, and now back to a wall, has the president finally decided what he wants to call his signature campaign promise? Morning Joe is back in a moment.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.